physical, mental, emotional energy. How do I manage my physical energy? Remembering that rest is not a reward, it's a strategy. Athletes know that. They know that they can't work at peak performance all the time. So why do we think that we're any different and think that we can drive ourselves without taking a break?
The New Zealand Business Podcast, brought to you by Gorilla Technology, your strategic and proactive IT partner.
Greetings and welcome along to the New Zealand Business Podcast. I'm your host, Paul Spain. Today we're talking with Rachel King, who's the founder of Quotient, a firm that is focused on helping people to work at what Rachel calls human speed. Now, humans, of course, are not machines, so we need to learn to work at a pace that is sustainable, or human pace, so that we can thrive and succeed in our work and in our lives, but doing so without burning ourselves out. And working faster does not always equal working better. It's possible to achieve amazing things at a sustainable pace. The New Zealand Business Podcast is proudly brought to you by Gorilla Technology, the information technology services firm helping smaller to medium New Zealand organisations with every aspect of technology enablement and uplift, whilst minimising technology and cyber risks. Let's jump in. Welcome along, Rachel. How are you?
Thank you. Good. Thanks for having me.
Look, this is a really, really interesting topic, particularly through interacting with the likes of the startup world and the tech world and things where things can move really, really quickly. I've certainly seen the varying challenges that we often get in terms of work pace, work-life balance, and so on. And I think anybody involved in business and entrepreneurship will have their own experiences, their own personal, successes and failures, and the same across their teams. So quite fascinated to learn more about human speed. So tell me a little bit about your background and what kind of drew you into sort of research and study and land on this as your business.
Yeah, well, I'm a civil engineer by background, so I worked in New Zealand and over in London as an engineer for a number of years, and I came out of that season and I had 3 kids under the age of 3, which was certainly a job that no one trained me up for. And that was a very chaotic season. It was these 3 unruly employees, or maybe they were my employers, and 24/7 demands. You didn't really know what you were going to get from
3
them.
bosses.
Yeah, 3 bosses. Yeah, exactly. Quite unpredictable bosses as well. And
no bosses like that in the real world, surely.
No, surely not. And so I threw myself into raising my kids, but I also wanted to feed my mind and read a lot of books around productivity, managing, organizing time, managing systems. They really were, if you can run a company of small children, I think you can do anything right. And I realized after coming out of that season, as they grew up a little bit, that I was more interested in the foundations of humans than the foundations of buildings. And I, studied psychology. I went over to the States and did some training in human personality and really realized that everything that I was learning and researching was very transferable to the workplace, and became really passionate about helping people, helping leaders, helping teams to thrive. And to thrive really means to work at human speed, not at an unrealistic, unsustainable pace.
Yeah, that's great. And I think, look, most of us, we want a great outcome for those of us that we're working with. We don't want to burn people out and destroy them. We want to help individuals be successful and well-rounded. And getting burnt out doesn't tend to help with that. So break it down for us. Why have you landed on this approach, and what have you seen out there in the real world and the workplaces that you're interacting?
Yeah, well, I think, with any teaching sustainable ways of working and human-centered productivity, you can teach all the tools and tips and strategies in the world, but if you don't look at what's driving it, at the why, you're trying to diagnose without looking at foundations. Again, as an engineer, you always start with the foundations. So I think for me, I was really fascinated about why were we burning out? Why was everybody obsessed with going so fast? And I think when you look back to Industrial Revolution, to go to work at speed meant you were more productive. You produced more widgets on the machines. But now, as knowledge workers working in the world of knowledge and information, to churn out more emails, to reply to more messages doesn't actually make you more productive. You're inclined to burn out. There's essentially infinite possible things you could be doing, infinite possible messages you could be replying to. And if we think that we can get through them all like the widgets on a factory line, we're really dreaming, aren't we?
How does AI sort of play into this?
To be honest, I think there's some great things that AI is doing, absolutely, but it's also making it worse in terms of the volume of information, the volume of possible demands and requests and pings and things coming at us. And as humans, again, if we go back in time, if you were in agriculture and you were wanting to harvest grains, you hadn't finished until you'd done the whole thing, right? And so we can think, I'm not finished until I've replied to every message, till I've responded to every request. But this is now an impossible task, right? If 8 billion people in the world can email you at any moment, you can't possibly respond to all of them. So
hopefully we're not all getting 8 billion messages a day, although, if you were to take all the spam into consideration, there's certainly a lot of messages floating around on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. And when you think about this idea of busyness, we've really come to equate busy with important. If you bump into anyone on the street, how are you going? Busy. Busy is the answer. And there's a story told of someone who immigrated to the States that when they would ask anyone how they were, the person would respond busy. And this person came to think that the word busy must mean good. How are you? Good. How are you? Busy. That they were interchangeable. And we've really got to ask ourselves, hang on a minute, am I addicted to busy for busy's sake, or am I channeling my energy into work that matters and work that's important?
And what's the relationship with being a workaholic? Because we see that being part of the mix, right? It can be very easy to be really busy and work too much. And how do you guide people there in terms of?
Yeah, really good question. And again, I think it's this idea, if we've got the mindset that our value is tied up in how busy we are, then it's going to be quite hard to separate that out. If I can realize that my value is not just in how much time I spend doing things, but what if I'm doing good things, meaningful work that moves the needle, not just how much of it, but actually the valuable work. So sometimes it takes a while sitting with people and going, hey, just because you're insanely busy, it doesn't mean, that if you were less busy, you were less valuable. So that's a mindset shift, and depending where people are at on their journey, it can certainly take time.
So when you look at people that have gone through, burnout, what do you see? What are the commonalities there? Yeah,
so it is busyness related. So they have not seen their limits. And just to go back a step for a second, back in time, leisure time was seen as you had value if you had a lot of leisure time. Now, if you have a lot of leisure time, our society sees that as lazy. And I'm not saying that we all want to sit around and do nothing, but we've got to get the balance and not see working all the time as bringing value. So, yeah, back to your question around what are the common patterns in people who have burnt out. They haven't paused and questioned the way that they're working. And I'm really passionate about helping people see, before they fall off the burnout cliff, that actually there could be another way of doing things. What if I did less but actually channeled my energy into work that moves the needle?
Where are the areas that the most people get burnt out? I think listeners will be curious within each of our organisations. We want to keep them healthy, and so part of that is knowing where to look for problems. So are there particular types of roles, particular types of personalities? What are the things that when you look at those, it helps you get a handle on where that busyness and then the burnout may come from?
Yeah. So this is a very, very much tied to New Zealanders. New Zealanders are not great at saying no. We like to jump in and say yes, and we like to help. And if you find it hard to set boundaries and you find it hard to say no, you're very prone to burning out if you're saying yes to everybody. Because with email, with Teams, with phones, with this digital age that we're in, we are available to anyone on the planet to ask us to do something. And so if we see every request, every message as something that we must respond to, we're almost on an inevitable path to burnout at that point. So absolutely, people that struggle with boundaries are going to be, top of the list for burnout. Also, the classic A-type personalities, the high achievers, the people that see driving for goals and results as the only goal in life. And obviously, we can achieve great things when we have that real drive and motivation, but often that comes at the expense of paying attention to our limits, our health, our well-being, our mental well-being, our physical well-being. So that could be another area.
But help us understand, because we probably haven't all had a lot of experiences necessarily with sort of a severe, burnout type scenarios. Some will, some won't. Maybe you can just walk us through what are the consequences, what are the outcomes, whether it's on people's individual, family lives, on businesses, what are the things that you've seen?
Yeah, well, burnout can certainly have a physical, mental, emotional component. So physically, people can feel absolute exhaustion, which can also have quite dramatic health impacts. It reduces our immune system. There's cardio issues, stroke, all sorts of things can come out of those sorts of extreme physical impacts that burnout can have. Mentally, anxiety, depression, all sorts of things. Essentially, when we're not investing and paying attention to the needs of ourselves as human beings, that's when we can get these quite major issues. And on the emotional side, the extreme stress, extreme anxiety, our ability to handle emotions and to regulate our emotions becomes very low. So you asked what's the impact? It can have quite a global impact on our ability to work, on our ability to function as a human, and that's a more dramatic version. We can also have lower level burnout. Just most of us will relate to some form of exhaustion. So our bodies are designed to cope with stress. If you're running away from a tiger in the jungle, you go into that fight or flight mode, that red brain, you've got adrenaline and cortisol running through your system. And we need those hormones to escape a tiger in the jungle. The problem,
not too often, hopefully.
Not too often. The problem is we have those hormones surging through our bodies a lot because they are firing up just when we respond to an email. If we see an email as an emergency or an overflowing inbox or another demand or whatever it is. And it's when we are in that fight or flight state, that what I call red brain mode, constantly, that's when we prone to burnout or to, at least quite extreme exhaustion.
And what sort of implications do you have you seen or been aware of kind of across families and businesses in terms of what does that mean?
Yeah, people can really lose motivation and get quite disillusioned with what's the point? Why am I doing this? And sometimes people who have been through burnout really come back with actually a new set of now I have to have boundaries. That is impossible to live like that again. But my question is, why can't we learn before we run into that extreme level of challenge? How about we could listen to people who have gone before us and say, what if I could feel a real sense of satisfaction and know that I'm contributing well while still looking after my physical, mental, emotional energy and well-being as a human?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, makes a lot of sense. So, as someone that teaches people about these things and how to address them, walk us through what are the most common sorts of guidance that you provide?
Yeah. The first thing really is we've got to accept as humans that we cannot do it all. We can't parallel process like ChatGPT. We simply cannot do it all. And some of us have this kind of imaginary idea that if I just power on, if I just work a little bit harder, a little bit longer, if I add in my evenings and my weekends and whatever, maybe then I'll get to the bottom of my list. Maybe then I can stop. So we've got to realize that actually I'm never going to do it all. I've got to give myself permission to stop, to call an end to the day, to call an end to the week. It's really hard. I get it. We've got work in our pockets at every moment, right? But that first piece is awareness. If we don't have that awareness and that mindset shift, then I can throw all the tools in the world at people, but it just sort of becomes another little productivity tool and a slave to kind of drive you forward.
And, are there any tips maybe for those listening in who maybe haven't had any particular triggers that have kind of really lit up for them and have helped them realize that, maybe they're heading for a burnout of some sort? Are there sort of precursors that you can encourage people to kind of think about?
Yeah, if you're not having a lunch break, if you're not going home at a regular time, if you're not having a weekend, what's the first thing that you looked at in the morning when you woke up? What's the last thing that you looked at before you went to bed? If we are constantly plugged in and switched on every minute, we're going to head for burnout at some point. Sure, it's different personalities, different people will have different limits to how long they can sustain that for. But actually, at some point, we can't achieve the impossible. Even if we add the evenings and the weekends and try and do it all, we're probably increasing our capacity by, 0.5%. And there's 10,000% more inputs and demands still coming at us. It's an impossible task.
I think of some of the startup founders that I've spoken with, and I guess it's not just those that are sort of founding startups. Sometimes very well established firms where the leadership can be working crazy hours, the interns and the staff members and so on are working really crazy hours, and these companies are achieving amazing things. If I think through some of the more successful tech startup stories and so on in New Zealand, aerospace and so on, some of these people have worked really, really crazy hours, and they probably are not operating within what would be a normal sort of sweet spot. How does that end up kind of working in the long term? Because I think there is a degree to which you can work really hard during periods, and some people, as you say, there's these variances in terms of what people can work to, and if I don't know, if someone can work an 18-hour day and they're leading the business, there can be that sort of natural flow on to, well, if I can work that, then others can, and we need to push ourselves because this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. We're changing the world. We're going to help the New Zealand economy. We're doing these incredible things. How do you balance out that sort of thinking, and how do you get it right? And is there anything similar to a one-size-fits-all? Because I kind of imagine there are probably common themes, but there will be periods where these things will vary, or types of businesses where things are going to be extreme for periods, right?
Yeah, exactly. And seasons are part of it. So I think if you know that you're in a season, the early startup phase, but even giving yourself a framework around that season, how long is this sustainable for? And like you say, if I'm setting that tone, am I expecting all of my staff to operate at that same pace and to push themselves as hard? At what point, maybe I won't burn out as soon as someone else, but actually if this is just extended, because what becomes the challenge often is people say, oh, this is just a season, I'll slow down when X, and then I'll slow down when Y. But what happens is we never actually get there. And we've created this culture for ourselves where we never stop, we never slow down until we crash, on a holiday and we get sick or whatever it is. So when we can acknowledge it's a season and even sort of draw a line in the sand and say the next 3 months are going to be really tough, but actually we're going to put these things in place. It might even be putting some framing up in your calendar, blocking time to delineate, actually we're going to have some downtime here to absorb what is going to be a more stressful season.
And one thing, I think this was, chatting to Levi Fawcett from Partly, and he shared about his experience at Rocket Lab, and going there, straight from university, started at Rocket Lab. He hadn't even finished his degree. He got offered this role. I don't know, maybe he drove there from Christchurch to Auckland, and a few days later he was working. It sounded like he was living out of his car for a period of time, but in his own startup, and partly as we sort of delved in a little bit, there was definitely this variance between those with families. You were talking about family at the beginning, versus those that, maybe in an earlier or a different stage of life. And so different sort of capacities there as well, depending on an individual's circumstance.
Exactly. So yes, there are life stages, and some people are going to, some people will say to me, I want to work at this pace. And it's like, great, absolutely. Nobody's stopping you. I'm not going to say to people, slow down for the sake of it. People have to want to, they need to see the benefit of what a sustainable pace might look like. The challenge is that sometimes people who are younger and have higher capacity will drive themselves to burnout and then have some sort of heart issue or health issue. We can feel a little bit invincible when we're younger, can't we? And think we can do it all, and maybe we can to a point, but again, humans have limits.
Yeah, and then it's kind of, am I propping myself up with a coffee a day, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or energy drinks, or there's a range of stimulants available. So I guess there's a level with some of those things that can be an indicator, I guess, as can be sort of feedback from family and others, right? Where you need to be listening and considering, actually, I might be being empathetic to the needs of the business, but am I being empathetic to my own well-being, to my family and, relationship well-beings and so on as well?
Exactly. We've always got to ask ourselves, actually, what is the true cost of my actions here? So like you say, if I'm drinking 6, 7 coffees a day and energy drinks, if I'm drinking coffee to rev my system up in the morning and then alcohol in the evening to calm myself back down and then running on stress all the time in between, that will have an impact. It's just that we might not see it immediately, and it'll take us to a certain point, but the true cost of that is going to be shown at some point. But if people need they need to see the benefit of change and the benefit of working at a sustainable pace. And I, work with all sorts of people, and once they reset their pace to a sustainable pace, they're not doing less, they're just doing the work that matters, the meaningful, important work. So I'm not saying just sit back and don't achieve anything, but what if we could achieve amazing things in a more sustainable way?
So walk us through the types of organisations and people that you will tend to work with. Is it fairly broad?
It is broad, yep. I've worked with everyone from small teams, design studios of 5 or 6 people, right through to big corporates with many teams across the board, banks, tax companies, all sorts, across New Zealand and Australia. And every time, really, the theme of overwhelm just sits right across the people and the teams that I'm seeing. Just people who, there's so many inputs coming at them. There's so many possible things that they could be doing. They've lost the ability to filter well and feel a sense of satisfaction. They are, I'm sure most listeners will be able to relate to the idea of getting to Friday. You've had a frantic week and you think, what just happened? What did I do? And I want people to get to the end of their week and feel great about what they achieved. Know they did the work that mattered. Of course they didn't do it all. None of us could. But actually, what if we could go home and think, amazing, I did the work that mattered. I didn't just kind of chase my tail for a week.
All right. So how do you do it, Rachel?
Yeah.
What are the answers? What
Magic
are the tricks?
bullet, yeah. There's a few key things that I teach, and one of the first things around this idea that we've got these endless inputs, these emails, these messages, all these pings coming at us. A lot of people think to themselves, they sit down at their desk in the morning and they think, right, I'll just clear the decks, I'll just do all these little things, and then I'll start with that important job I've been planning on doing. But we all know what happens next, right? You start clearing the decks, more things come. People just keep filling up your decks. And it gets to 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the day, and you think, oh my goodness, I still haven't got to that work that I wanted to do. And the key here is just do the important thing first. We've got to learn to sit in the discomfort of the loose ends. I liken all these little emails to sand. It's like grit and sand. And we think, I'll just sweep away the sand, so I've got a nice clear spot to kind of park myself and do my work. We're never going to clear all the sand. We've got to sit in the discomfort of that grit and that sand and do the important work anyway. So one of the first things that I get people to do is schedule a power hour or a power 2 hours or whatever sort of block of time works for them, their business and their role, and do one of their most important tasks. And I've literally had people say to me, that was life-changing, just doing that one thing.
Mm-hmm. And what about for founders and leaders who may feel that only they can do certain things when maybe actually there should be some more delegation, or maybe it's actually hiring, new people, whether it's full-time roles or outsourcing to other firms and so on. What do you tend to see from those perspectives?
Yeah, so to founders, leaders, startups, I would say to those people, only do the things that only you can do. If there's something that someone else can do, and particularly if you have a staff member, if you've got someone employed, delegate it. You need to learn to let go of control. If there's someone else that can do it, give it to them. If you haven't employed someone else yet, you might want to consider, do you have the finances, the capacity to outsource? What are the things? Ask yourself, what are the things that only you can do? I get people to brainstorm a list. What are those things? Everything else is open to delegation.
Yeah. And what about for someone that's in a very, very small business? Maybe it's just themselves. Have you got approaches on that front?
Yeah. So once again, I would say start with the things that are really moving the needle. What is your purpose? What are you aiming for? Use that as your compass for what am I doing? What am I doing with this first hour of my day? So yes, even though it's all lands on you, don't fill the first hour or two chasing after the loose ends and clearing the decks and doing the little things. What if you didn't open your email for the first hour or two of the day? Would the world end? For most of us, the world probably won't end if we don't check our email first thing. If you're waiting for some sponsorship deal or some grant, or, if you miss an email, you'll lose $1 million funding, sure, check your emails. If not, give yourself permission to do the most important thing for your business first, rather than doing all the little things first. So I really get people to think about their time and their energy, and ideally treat the mornings as time to do those bigger picture, the strategy. What are the things that are going to move your business forward? And then treat the afternoon as a time to do your admin, the little things, the emails. So if you do just work for yourself, you can do a more simple split than that. Obviously, if you work with a team, it's a little bit more complex and you'll need to negotiate that split of time. But again, when I work with small teams, we do talk as a team and go, hang on a minute, what would be the best way that we can work together to maximize our ability to all be moving forward with our individual and collective team goals, those, that I call them the big rocks, the really important tasks that we want to do first, and then batch that other stuff to later on. Don't let that other little stuff dominate the day.
And what about planning and structuring a day, a week, a month, a year, and so on? Have you got your own, particular approaches on that front?
Yeah. So once again, it depends whether people work by themselves or whether they work in bigger teams. If we don't plan that important work into our calendars, it will never muscle its way in. So the work that humans are wired to respond to urgency. It's called the mere urgency effect. If something's got some kind of urgency, it's like a little fire alarm goes off in your brain and you jump in and you do it. And so what happens is that we treat everybody else's requests as a bit of an emergency and we respond to them. We get a little dopamine hit every time we tick some little thing off the list. But those big, important goals and tasks, they never shout at us. They don't have a little fire alarm that goes off. So they sit and wait quietly in the background until we attend to them. If I make time for those in my calendar, if I put those big rocks, if I map my calendar I want my calendar to reflect my priorities, not my day to kind of reflect this urgency and this panic mode that I'm operating in. Yeah. So getting them in the calendar, it sounds simple, and I know that there can be tasks that derail things, but if we set an intention, research shows we're 8 times more likely to do something that we put in our calendar than something that's just sitting in our head.
Mm. And how important are having processes and systems in terms of being able to, I guess, help you, be consistent and do things in a, maybe in a less stressful manner at times, and I guess there's an element there from a delegation perspective and so on as well.
Yeah, and in terms of systems and structures, time in itself is very organic. We can't actually control time. We can't control what happens. So I'm certainly not rigid with, there are people that are very rigid with time boxing, and if that works for them, great. But actually life happens, right? Things happen. Crises happen, plans change. So when I help people with planning, it's really a flexible and realistic plan that can move and flex with the realities of life. So absolutely, I say to people, plan in your important work, but have big buffer zones and room for movement within that. If we're too rigid with a structure, it ends up, we become a slave to it and we feel constantly stressed and frustrated because we can't actually achieve what we set ourselves to do.
Mm. And what do you tend to do or encourage during a given day? So you don't get to that kind of, it's 3 o'clock, where did the day go? What have I done? There must be some tips on that front.
Yep. Yeah. So planning out that time for the important work, but also planning in realities. So you might even put a buffer zone in your calendar for the unexpected. So the average person has around 2 hours of unexpected or unplanned work a day, and that's an average. Each role is going to be quite different. But if I've planned 8 hours of my calendar, and then on average I'm going to get 2 hours of sort of interruptions and little tasks and things, I need somewhere to absorb that. I don't want it to always be my evenings and my weekends. So sometimes I get people to put that buffer zone in their calendar and say, where is the flex? Where's the ability to absorb that? And obviously you don't know when that's going to come, but it gives you the ability then to move things around. So popping in buffer zones is really important. Putting in lunch breaks. If you're someone who is terrible at remembering to take a lunch break, put it in your calendar. Mm. Sometimes people put in time for managing emails and tasks. Again, it's quite personal preference. The key really is that you get that important work in the calendar, and then I really work with people and their personalities and say, well, what is going to work for you? I want this to feel like an invitational roadmap, not something that's rigid and that feels quite restrictive to you.
Yeah, that's often the challenge to these things, isn't it? Is making them fit with the work that you do, your own pressures and requirement, and your own environment, the people you're working with, and so on.
Yeah, and it's important as well that people think about energy management. We talk about time management. Time is very finite. Energy is renewable. So if we can align our work to our energy, we can actually achieve a lot more in the time that we've set aside. Most of us are more creative and do more lateral problem-solving type thinking in the morning, research shows. So if you know that's you, schedule it for the morning. Don't leave it till the afternoon when you've had a day full of, crises and firefighting and things to sort out, to then try and do planning that big important task. So some people will say to me, I work way better in the afternoon. I'm not a morning person. I work better in the afternoon. I say, great, block that time, but you're going to have to be more protective of it because probably more little interruptions will come at you as the day wears on. Start of the day, less wheels have fallen off. So if you can get a power hour in there, you're kind of winning. If you wait till the afternoon to do that important thing, more wheels have fallen off. You've got more little things coming at you, and it can be quite hard to focus when you know there's 10,000 other things.
Now, what about the role of, for ourselves and our teams of working to our strengths versus our weaknesses, and, how you should balance that? How much effort should you put in or encourage, others to put in around improving in the areas where, maybe they're not so strong versus other areas? How do you look to that? Because there is a difference, right? When you're doing something you love, that tends to uplift you and give you energy. When you're doing something that it's the opposite end of the scale, then that can drag you down, right? And that can take away your energy.
Exactly. So I do get people to map out, what do you love? What energizes you? What do you run to? What do you do well? What do you do naturally? What sparks your energy when you jump into it? Work out what those things are. Most of us can figure that out pretty quickly. And then do another list. What drains you? What just feels like a drag? What are you likely to procrastinate on? And now go down that list of what drains you and ask yourself, can I delegate or outsource this? And I know that for solopreneurs and founders, you don't always have someone to outsource it. Sometimes you just got to show up and do it. And I get that. But it's quite good to have the awareness. If there's something that's really draining and you have to do it, you might want to just do it in short bursts. Give yourself realistic bursts to attack that. Try not to leave it all to the last minute when you're going to go into panic mode to do it. And match it, put it alongside something that does energize you. So you're doing a little bit of both. But absolutely. The things that you can outsource that really drag you down, do it. Don't hesitate, because that'll give you more energy and more drive to do the things you do well, and hopefully then you can afford to keep paying that person to do the stuff you don't want to do.
And what about, I've heard this concept of rewarding yourself. So you do the hard thing or the thing you don't like, but then you kind of work in some sort of a reward. Hey, once I've done this, then I can have that break or whatever that thing may be.
Yeah. Some people are quite motivated by rewards. I think, again, it's quite personality based. So some people starting, the concept of eat your frog, do the worst first. Mark Twain famously said, if you get up in the morning and eat a frog, nothing worse will happen in your day. Yeah. I think that can sometimes work, but for some people it can really drain them. And it drags them down and they can't get through anything else. But if you are someone who's quite results and rewards driven, great. Do set yourself a time limit. You might just say to yourself, I'm going to do 5 or 10 minutes on this hard thing. And that might sound like a really tiny amount of time. But if you say to yourself, I've got to do 2 hours on the hard thing, you're more likely to procrastinate. If you set 5 or 10 minutes, you might get into it. You know how sometimes you get into something and it turns out it wasn't so bad after all.
Yeah.
So start with 5 minutes, have a tiny goal. It's okay, and if that's all you do, you still did what you set out to do, and do another 5 minutes in your next block.
Yeah, okay. Now, in terms of resources to help people out, what are the approaches that you recommend and that you're finding are working for people, because you've got your own resources. So walk us through a little bit there.
Yeah. So the first thing that I say to everybody when we're thinking about how do we work at human speed is that we've got to start with purpose. What is the purpose of my role? What is the purpose of our organisation? Where are we heading? And before I'll talk about the tool that I use, but a story that really illustrates this idea of purpose really well is the Nike Breaking 2 project. So back in 2017, when Nike set out to break the 2-hour marathon barrier, they wanted to create a shoe that, would do that. And every single person that was invested in that project, their goal was to make the shoe go faster. How do we what can we do? Are we all aligned to helping Kipchoge run this marathon in under 2 hours? And they did it. 2 years later, they achieved that goal. And so we want to, when we're thinking about our own work and aligning our energy and what we do with that work, is what I'm doing moving us forward? Am I crystal clear on that goal? Just like Nike were clear on their goal to make the shoe go faster, am I crystal clear on what my goal is? So once we've got that clarity, how do we filter everything, right? How do we filter and every input that comes at me, whether it's somebody asking me a question, whether it's a meeting request, whether it's a Teams message, whether it's an email, I need to filter everything. I've got to ask the question, is this something that I should be spending my time on? And some people will have heard of the Eisenhower matrix, the urgency and importance matrix. It's quite a good filter to figure out where in that matrix each request that's coming at you fits and ask yourself what you're going to do. So it looks at urgency and importance. So the first quadrant, you've got the genuinely urgent and genuinely important work. So I call those the code reds. They're the little fire alarms. We have to jump in and do those. So our triage approach to those is to do it. It's common sense. None of us needs to ask ourselves whether we're going to do it. Our brains just fire up and we do it. The second quadrant we've got, which I call the zone of impact, is our non-urgent but important work. That's the work that doesn't scream at us. It flies out the back of our heads when we're caught in the urgency. So that is the work that if something comes to me and I realize it's in that zone of impact, it's going to make the shoe go faster, but it's not urgent, I've got to plan that into my day, my week, my month, my year. So where in my calendar is that going to fit? If I don't map it into my time, it's going to fall out the back of my head. So that's the key one. What am I going to do? How am I going to plan it? The quadrant where we all fall over is that third quadrant, which is the urgent but not important. I call this the false alarm quadrant.
Yes.
Now, most of us don't think we're in that quadrant. We think that we're just dealing with genuine, urgent and important, but actually we get tripped up there all the time. So urgent but not important. There was a study called the mere urgency effect, which is the fact that humans respond to urgency. We don't question the value of things. And ironically, the busier you are, the more likely you are to respond to urgency and get caught in that urgency addiction.
Is there an element here where it helps to, I guess, draw on other members of your team to help you see things? Because I will recognize in others, why are they doing that? We don't need to be doing that. And sometimes others will be able to see those things for me and like, Paul, why are you wasting your time on that? Do we really need to be doing that? It's like, oh yeah, thanks for the reminder. So yeah, sometimes there's an element where, we either need to get some outside help or we need to step outside of ourselves a little bit or that just doing that analysis on the things that are coming at us, especially when they've got that urgent element, right?
Yeah, exactly. And you're right that it can often be easier to see it in others than ourselves. We get caught up and we don't pause and question whether what we're doing is the work that matters. So when I teach this framework to people, I encourage them as a team to use it to, like exactly what you say, to support each other and to challenge each other. Hey, are you working in that zone of impact right now? If not, why? Is what I'm doing actually more important than what I planned to do? So is that little false alarm that's just pinged, was that genuinely more important? Because our brains, as I said, we're wired for emergency, but we see everything with having that little fire alarm attached. Learning to filter between a fire alarm and a false alarm is essential. That's really where the work comes. If we can do that, we can do anything.
And of course, it's not as simple as sort of black and white as that, right? So yeah, everything's on this sort of scale, this continuum. So, there's a level usually to things of, you're doing something that's urgent because there is a benefit, but it's more actually if you were to stack up every single thing that you could be doing and then you prioritize appropriately, the more that we do that and we're being quite thoughtful and mindful about it, then we focus on the right things. But that can get thrown out in a busy day where things come across or pop into your head that wasn't on your list of priorities and your plan for the day.
Yeah, and it really is learning to pause and reflect. Urgency doesn't welcome a pause. It welcomes a very quick reaction, right? We want to shift ourselves from reacting to responding. When I'm in response mode, I can make wise, intentional choices. When I'm in reaction mode, I just do the thing without thinking. And so, as you say, it's not black and white, but actually the pause gives us that moment to question ourselves, to ask us, where am I sitting right now? Am I in that zone of impact, or have I found myself pulled into the zone of busy work, the zone of distraction and false alarms?
Yeah. Any other tips and advice that we've missed, Rachel?
I talked, around managing your energy. So physical, mental, emotional energy, how do I manage my physical energy? Remembering that rest is not a reward, it's a strategy. Athletes know that. They know that they can't work at peak performance all the time. So why do we think that we're any different and think that we can drive ourselves without taking a break? So taking breaks. Micro breaks are important, so 5 or 10 minute breaks to recharge your brain can be really helpful, and there's a lot of research around those, but also bigger breaks as well. Lin-Manuel Miranda came up with the idea for Hamilton on a holiday. He didn't do it by driving himself into the ground. So there's pretty amazing things that people achieve when they integrate rest. So in terms of managing ourselves really well, physical energy, rest is a key part of that. Managing our mental energy and our ability to focus is really noticing actually what are the things that are pulling me away, what are pulling me down. It's the notifications, it's the pings, the distractions. So when you're working on that important work, can you create for yourself a space that gives you the conditions to focus? I know that for people in open plan offices, it's a lot harder. If there's a space that they can go and work, even for an hour, when you're doing that work that requires that deep focus, is your environment, your physical and your digital environment, conducive to that, to boosting your mental energy? And then, just your emotional energy, tools to manage stress. Again, it can be things, taking those micro breaks, getting outside, going for a walking meeting can help regulate our emotions. Sometimes meetings or high stakes conversations can be stressful, but walking reduces our cortisol, it reduces our stress levels. So thinking, I often talk to people about weaving small things into the day. So it's not necessary to think, I've got to do this huge, I'm just going to work myself into the ground and then have a holiday at the end of the year. What if I could weave in those micro breaks daily, hourly, so that I don't burn out by the time I get to Christmas?
And one thing I often come across is, especially in smaller organisations, but there's all sorts of variations on the theme, is the challenge of being able to work on a business rather than in a business, right? And we often hear that saying you need to be working, especially, smaller organisations. But I think it happens across the board at times. We're not always sort of stepping back. So it sounds like all of these things will actually help us get our heads into a space that's more strategic rather than just, always inside the nuts and bolts and unable to think. And I guess Bill Gates has always been one of those examples where you'd hear about him taking, a week out every year to read books and so on, and just sort of a thinking time. He's ended up doing well. I don't know how much of that you could lay back to the fact that he takes these chunks of time out. But there's a lot to be said for some quite simple practices, right? Like taking these blocks of time out, reading a book rather than getting bombarded with other things.
Exactly. And if Bill Gates can do it, why can't we,
true.
right? Take the week out. So we can sort of overinflate the sense of importance and that I have to be always on, and maybe the world will stop spinning if I sit and read a book for half an hour. But will it really? Will someone die if I leave the office for half an hour? What will happen? And we want, if you're a startup, if you're a founder and there's a lot to do, yes, you might have that busy season that we talked about earlier. But if you want it to be sustainable, if you're in it for the long game, what if you set yourself up to align with your natural pace and energy as a human rather than try and work at the pace of ChatGPT?
Okay. Now, to finish up, I'm thinking of some of our past guests, founders of the biggest businesses in the country, former politicians or prime ministers. Some of these folks, they are juggling a lot, and it does seem as though the only way for them to operate is at times on these kind of 18-hour days. What do you give to people that are in that time? They're in this period where that's how they have to operate. Maybe we've covered it already, maybe not, but you're talking to a current prime minister or someone that's part way on a journey to building the next zero or something.
Yeah, I'd still say to them, what are you doing? What are you weaving into your day to make this sustainable for you? How is your time structured? Where is the rest and recovery time? And it doesn't have to be, the week a year that Bill Gates had, but the little moments, because if we don't have those, at some point the wheels are going to fall off. And you do hear a lot of politicians and successful high achievers that hit burnout and wish that they'd done something differently. So if I was talking to someone, at that point before they'd done that, it's okay, let's do a stock take. Again, what are the things that only you can do? What are you not letting go of that you should?
Are we getting better or worse as a society in terms of understanding the need for people to have breaks and rest and to not overwork themselves? The number of times that there's been politicians that have got bad attention. This is on an international basis, not specific to New Zealand, but they've decided to take some time out, and then of course there's a crisis or something that happens, and of course the media's all over them, and hey, that person, that prime minister or that president shouldn't be doing that right now. They should be right here addressing it. And when I see those things, I sort of see it from both perspectives, and I'm not sure that we always get that right from probably both sides.
Yeah, it's a good question of whether we're getting better or getting worse. I think certainly that, the blowing up of the quiet quitters and Gen Z and doing things differently and setting better boundaries, they are a different generation that are asking some of those questions around, is grinding myself into the ground, is this the only way to work? So I think we do see some generational shifts. As a culture and overall, whether we're getting better, I don't know. I think the stats are still pretty bad on burnout. 2/3 of New Zealanders are burning out. So I think we've still got a long way to go. And knowing that our value isn't only in how much I produce, how many widgets, but what if it was more in the meaning? When I can have that mindset shift, it can help me to choose to work more intentionally and sustainably.
And what about leaders who look at some of the newer ways in which people operate, quiet quitting, or a business where traditionally people have worked longer hours, and then a different type of workforce has come in, and staff are out the door the moment it strikes the hour of finishing. How should leaders be thinking about these sorts of changes and guiding their own thinking and their teams to the best results? Because we see some really good stuff that I guess comes out of probably current thinking, but we also see some flip sides, right? Where sometimes the results might not be so effective, and you end up with people who aren't maybe contributing at the level that they should.
Yeah. And, if somebody is spending less time but achieving amazing things, so if they are very intentional, and then you've got someone else that takes 3 times longer, we've traditionally been inclined to see the person who is in the office for 60 hours as the more productive person.
Which doesn't make any sense.
Doesn't make any
right?
sense. I read a story about a locksmith, and the locksmith said that initially he spent maybe, say, an hour. So someone will call him out. They'd pay him $200. He might take 45 minutes to do the lock, and they thought, great, amazing, brilliant job. He got better and better at his job to the point that he could fix that lock in 2 minutes. But if he fixed the lock in 2 minutes, people didn't think that was worth $200. But he's just saved them. They didn't have to stand outside for 45 minutes. So it's an interesting one, isn't it? That as humans, we've come to equate the amount of time and effort you spend as being valuable. But what if we saw it in terms of the results? So if I've got someone that can produce amazing results in less time, why can't I value them as highly as someone who's there 60, 70 hours? So yes, we have a problem if the quiet quitting looks like not even contributing, if there's a lack of motivation. But what if there's someone with amazing buy-in, focus, and they are really nailing what you want them to nail, but they're not going to do it in 60, 70 hours.
And in those sort of cases, you can hopefully see the benefits, right?
It's been interesting post-COVID where, this whole question of, do people need to be back at their desks? Do I need to see the person sitting at their desk to know that they're working? Or can I let the results speak for themselves? So I think a lot of leaders and managers are still quite challenged by that, feel like they need to monitor and watch how much work is being done. That is that old way of thinking, and we need to challenge ourselves if that's how we're feeling. If the person's achieving the results, doesn't matter how long it took them.
Yeah, and that can be a problem in some organisations to understand, and measuring things is a challenge. So if you don't have a way to kind of measure the results, then it becomes hard, and it becomes easy, I guess, to default to other approaches, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I remember back in London when I was working as an engineer, and I'd come from New Zealand, and New Zealanders are sort of viewed pretty highly over there. And I actually got told by a manager that I needed to slow down the speed of my work so that they could charge the client more, which I thought was absolutely absurd. So that it's still there.
Yeah, and look, we do have industries that work in different ways, and one of the conversations, in fact, having it today with somebody in a professional services field. I think it was in the legal world, and we were having this chat around the role of artificial intelligence, right? And I've had this discussion, I guess, in varying forms with people across all sorts of industries, right? And there's this level to which actually, if you perform better in terms of what you do in a given time, whether it's through technology uplift and leverage, whether it's just through having more productive people and so on, then there can be an anti-reward, because it actually ends up meaning that you don't bill as much. So to your locksmith example, if they were being billed not by a minimum 1 hour charge or what have you, and they were billing by the minute that they were there, that doesn't necessarily play out very well. So these become quite challenging things for industries to have to work through the changes as tech and automation and robotics and so on, they all become part of the picture, and we have to work out new ways to think around, well, how should that work now? Yeah,
exactly. That shift from billing just as a time-based thing to a value-based or an output-based. And like you say, in that tech space and AI space, a lot of people are having to reconsider that.
Well, that's great. Well, thank you so much for coming on the New Zealand Business Podcast, Rachel King. Much appreciated. Now, for folks that are maybe interested in learning a bit more from you, whether it's, engaging with you to help their teams or their people, where can they go and find out a little bit more?
Yeah, my website is quotient.nz, which is quotient.nz. And yeah, I'd love to hear from anyone who's keen to chat.
Great. And you're on LinkedIn as well.
Yep.
So, reasonably easy to track down and to get in touch with.
Yep, absolutely.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time. It's been a really fascinating chat, and I'm sure listeners will be walking away with a few thoughts, whether it's tips that they need to apply themselves or things that they can take in and help their teams with. So thank you.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of the New Zealand Business Podcast. Be sure to look up our other episodes featuring many of New Zealand's most innovative and successful founders and leaders. The New Zealand Business Podcast is brought to you by Gorilla Technology, the information technology services company focused on helping New Zealand's smaller to medium organisations to maximise the uplift they gain from innovative technology use whilst minimising cyber risks. If it's time for your organisation to know where it stands from a technology or cybersecurity perspective, visit gorillatechnology.com today and inquire about a technology or cybersecurity audit.
The New Zealand Business Podcast, brought to you by Gorilla Technology, your strategic and proactive IT partner.